So I'm going to be talking a bit about how I use just agents in general, and as well as using TRAE to kind of increase my general product output with increasing the concurrency. So I guess a little bit about me. So I'm part of the Web Infra team at ByteDance, and we work on a lot of build tooling. So I don't know if any of you have ever heard of RSPack or any of that ecosystem. You might have heard of Webpack. So essentially, I was on the core team at Webpack, and we ported Webpack into Rust and created a whole ecosystem around it. So I also work on, created something called Module Federation, which is kind of like distributed code sharing at runtime in the server and the browser. And I'm a very heavy user of AI. So I guess getting into it, what I kind of want to go through is a bit around, it's going to be a hodgepodge of things that I've kind of found useful. But I would say kind of one of the big things that I've noticed overall is the planning aspects. So what I'm going to start this talk with is a bit about what I really enjoy about TRAE itself. And one big aspect is the planning of it. So the nice thing that I really like is it's good at planning. Generally, I found the Q context engine to be quite good at getting a general understanding of your code base. And it has a really, especially in solo mode, it has a really nice user interface. So when it goes to, spec out things or create docs, there's a good viewer for it. It's quite visual. And, overall, it's just a convenient and nice interface to work with. Before using this, I would usually generate similar kind of docs and have to stick it into a gist to get it to render the diagrams to check everything. So it's really nice when you just see it kind of build something out like this, and you get good UMLs, other kind of visual cues in there as well. And what I found is the visualizations aren't necessarily super useful to me, but when I pass these to other AI agents, it's a really good way for it to have a quick way to understand that this connects to that. So it helps a lot as the code base gets larger and larger for it to understand kind of where it should start exploring just by it reading the kind of mermaid graphs itself to use as a guide within larger code bases. So another really nice thing that I like about TRAE is just the kind of build and iterate flow. So once it kind of gets through its planning and does its docs, it obviously has its ready to build where it can kind of kick off and start, the build process. And a really nice thing that I like is, especially in front end, it's got really good feedback loops or tight feedback loops. So if I compare this to say like some CLI tools or other things like that, the feedback loop is a little bit more tricky because it's mostly text only. So like the thing that I love the most about TRAE is the integrated browser. So I'm working on something, especially in the front end space. Yes, I can write a bunch of end-to-end tests, and that sometimes works, but so how many of you are front-end devs here or work in front-end? Okay, a few. Not a lot. Okay. So in the front-end world, you run into a lot of these visual issues. So a big one is like, oh, okay, I'm using Flexbox and maybe something's floating off to the side. Or maybe, hey, why is this blue? It's ugly. The rest of the site, looks different. Now I can type out, hey, the buttons are blue, make them not blue. But I have to paste in the link or copy the markup from the browser. It's a very cumbersome process for the model to understand, okay, where is it you're talking about this? So a really cool feature I love is it's got the built-in selector. So I can select something. You'll see I have a green box around it, and there's a little add to chat at the bottom. So I can just add that into the chat and be like, these shouldn't be blue. And now it knows what I'm talking about. On top of that, the agent can actually see the browser errors when it's running this, so it can debug some runtime aspects as well, which is, I've just found like this type of interface is much more efficient versus like the text-oriented one where you have to copy and paste or explain it in. It's really, really great for tweaks and modifications on your interface. So I really do appreciate that. So obviously a big thing that I've kind of noticed with these models or with just agentic coding is, it's all around context. And context is very difficult to kind of wrangle, and each model I've discovered has different preferences for context and prompting, but TRAE does a really good job around the context engine. So I would say like a really big difference between say like TRAE IDE and your standalone CLI agents, and while I use both of these tools quite heavily, a big thing that the CLIs lack is, this idea of a RAG or the ability to kind of understand beyond invoking it right now. So Generally, when I'm using a CLI tool, it starts cold each time. It has to understand what is it about this code base, how does it work, where are things going, so on and so forth. And I know agentic search got really big kind of when CLI tools came out. And in the beginning, I really fell in love with agentic search because it was like, okay, we're freed from like the need of a RAG, which is kind of slow and annoying to index everything. But what I had found is as a code base gets larger, you start to really need like conceptual links, because the agentic search is really good for like finding a couple things, but what happens when there's 45,000 files in the code base? It's not going to be able to find every single instance. Or if the words don't exactly match, it's just a lot harder for it to remember to keep tracing, following imports, so on and so forth. But with RAG and the Q engine, I can give it a concept and it can immediately, what I really like as well is like when I start the first chat in a new chat, when I'm doing this in like a CLI tool, there's some back and forth, you see it kind of rummaging around, but when I can do it in TRAE, the first message, it's like, oh, okay, yes, this, and it just starts doing it. And it always kind of catches me off guard because it kind of jumps right into it from the first message. And so I owe a lot of that just to it's got a really good context engine. So I really do enjoy the context engine that's available in TRAE. So Solo is probably my most favorite feature that they introduced. The big thing that I have found is as the agentic coding gets better and better, the need for the actual editor becomes kind of like the thing you look at occasionally. I would say most of the stuff that I do, I look at the code in GitHub, and that's where I'm looking at code. Unless I need to like go and like run the debugger myself and do something specific, the first time I'll see the code is in the diff of the PR. And then I can adjust it, tweak it, send it back, so on and so forth. So what's really important to me in this kind of world is going to be real estate, especially for the terminal. So in the case of where I want to use, say, my TRAE Solo chat, but then I might want to use CLI chat as well, the terminal, I absolutely love it, because now I have this big real estate, yet I can still hop over to the editor, copy a file path, drag it back in here, so it's a lot more convenient since most of my time is spent like talking. So the layout is probably one of my favorite things to just have available. So, okay, so that's a bit about just the things that I like and like how I use these things. I kind of want to get a bit into the workflow that I use day to day, or things that I've just kind of noticed. So I would say generally I work on usually around 11 code bases concurrently throughout the day. And I would say I can manage about 50 agents in parallel before things start to get a little unwieldy. But in doing all of that, there's some very interesting lessons that have kind of been learned along the way. So the first thing, and I think somebody kind of mentioned this, where they're like, okay, agents aren't quick, or research has shown you are less productive when doing AI coding. And I think this is a sliding scale. Usually I'll see this with like, so since I work in open source quite a bit, I'll usually see like open source authors will say this, that AI is slower than doing it themselves. Generally, that's because they know the code base very, very well, and they're usually quite specialized. So it is most likely quicker for them to go and do it. And I've felt that quite a bit, especially as models went into thinking, they got a lot slower. So the way that I kind of solve this problem is really you need to increase the concurrency. So if it takes longer to do one task on average, you also end up with a ton of idle time because you're just sitting there staring at the screen. So how do you solve that problem where you have less idle time and essentially you can now increase the amount of output you're capable of doing by just having more concurrent work being done? So a big thing that I also do is whenever I kind of start off with something, I'm a big fan of like the deep research. So I kind of got the idea from, OpenAI. But the idea is whether it's a CLI or anything, when I start on kind of a subject matter or something I'm going to work on, the first thing I'll do is say, hey, go deep research this area. If I kind of know in general we're going to be working on A, B, and C, I'll drag the folders in, or maybe certain files that I know this is where we're going to begin the work, and I say, hey, deep research this. Essentially prime the agent to understand what does it import, who depends on it, how is it connected in the code base, what's the intent behind what the code is actually doing, and really try to heat up the agents to make sure that they generally understand where they're going, what they're doing, and how the code base kind of exists around them. Often I'll try to use like sub-agent tasks when possible to speed up the research, because it can take maybe 10 to 15 minutes for it to just crawl through everything. But a big thing is I'll say, okay, maybe let it have 20 minutes to just dig around, look at things, understand. And from there, then I would actually start working. The big thing is I know a lot of people, at least I see this on LinkedIn a lot, is like, here's my prompt to change the world. And it's like, these massive, you've seen these kind of baity prompt things on LinkedIn. So I come across a lot of that. And what's interesting is, especially on Twitter, when I kind of talk about some of the things I might have done or how I'm making AI do something, people are like, oh, what's the prompt you're using? And my usual replies are something like, fix this. And I pass it a file. So I'm probably the laziest prompter in the world. Most of my prompts are one sentence, maybe two. But I still get really, really good results from it. I don't have a lot of churn, and I think generally the projects that I'm also working on are quite large and complex, and they're existing projects versus new things. But I found if you prime it, research this, understand how it works, and then often if I want to kind of warm it up a bit more, I'll ask it questions. How does this work? How does that go over there? I'll know how that does that, but prompting the model to do the research so that it understands the why already, I don't have to write this massive kind of stenciled out prompt for it to go and do something. I can just say, hey, the test is failing on this, go and fix it. And it has enough context now to understand what to do. I think it's also kind of important, depending on the model that you're using, there's also different preferences. So for example, GPT-5 I found does better with less prompting. Like I know in Claude models, you would capitalize something to really emphasize it. That doesn't really work in GPT-5, and it doesn't really care what you think. It's going to kind of just go off and do its own thing. So I found less is more in that specific model. I found things like Grok code models are much better with like a defined narrow scope as well. So knowing your model and kind of how it works is, I would say, like, it's very, very advantageous. And they just have some different preferences in how you kind of prompt them. And figuring that out gets you a lot more mileage out of what they're doing and how well they do it. I would say one last thing is, a model is not a replacement for knowledge. So the way that I use all of these is if my knowledge cap is here, I might push the model like a little higher. But generally, I'm not going to have it go and do something that I wouldn't be able to do myself. Now, I found my need to understand a language is slightly less, but your need to understand architecture and critical thinking, details, depth, things like that is still very, very important. But ultimately, the model is it's going to be slightly worse than you are. So it's not a replacement for how well you understand things. It's really just giving you more hands to go and do stuff. Maybe slightly worse than you can, but in general, it's more hands. It's not a silver bullet. So a big thing, again, that I try to do with these things is to parallelize all the tasks. And this is kind of tricky to do. The industry's kind of still warming up to how we do this well. So I've kind of done it in various ways. So one scenario is I'll just manually do it. So I have lots of instances of TRAE running, doing things. I will use Git work trees to kind of split things up. Or I'll just have lots of terminal tabs open with different CLIs running in there, doing different things. Sometimes it'll be on the same branch. Sometimes it might be on a different one. But the idea is, okay, what can I do that's not related to this area or might not cause a huge conflict? And try to figure out how you can map that out. So, usual cases I'll find is like, okay, hey, let's go in and harden our tests here because we could actually do better in testing here while you go and work on this feature. So there's two things that I can kind of do to speed it up or split it up. Or, I work in open source a lot, so usually I'll have them go look at Git issues and try to solve them in the background on a different work tree. So things that, is either direct delivery that I want to do or delivery that I'm not able to do due to capacity constraints, that as long as I can manage the concurrency, I have a lot more capacity to do stuff. And so the way I've kind of described how I imagine this stuff, the ideal case I would want in the future for this is almost like you have a TV with tons of channels. And so my job is to page through the channels really quickly, see what programs I like, and kind of keep going. Because that's essentially what you can get to, depending on how autonomous you go. But the interface to be able to do that is still kind of lagging behind a bit. But essentially, try to parallelize stuff. A big other issue I found is collision avoidance, and this is still a really tough one that nobody's quite solved out in a super automatic way. But there's a few kind of tricks that you can do to help work around collision avoidance. So depending on the tool you're using, different kind of tricks to it. But in like CLI tools, most of them have some kind of plugin system. Usually what I'll do is I'll implement something like Mutex, if anybody's from like a Rust background or kind of back-end languages. I just know Mutex from Rust, but essentially some kind of like lock file on it. So if you have multiple agents who are going to go and edit the file, if one is already, they essentially can reserve the file with like a little node script and just await until the lock is removed. So now 4 or 5 of them want to edit this, they will just sit there and wait until the lock is removed, and then the edits will kind of follow up. So something like that does help a huge amount, and I usually for these, whatever tool I use, I'll just use AI to write the tool, like to write the handler for this. And you know, so it works pretty well, and I don't really have to do a whole lot. Another good one is work trees. I see work trees probably as the best scenario. It's just kind of annoying to manage that by hand. But with work trees, you can do things, you know, branch it off here, and then the idea would be, is this a separate pull request, or is it concurrent work you want to do? And then what I would do is I would have something like GPT-5, the Codex models, rebase the work trees back onto the main branch. So I could work on several conflicting things for the feature, and then have, at the end of it, somebody rebase all the work trees back together, and they can kind of understand, well, what was the intent behind each thing? Now collapse it all back into the one branch, and I've essentially avoided any potential collisions. And then I would say, you know, another big one really is to try to keep the scope narrow. This is kind of good for context, token cost, and just making sure the model doesn't go too crazy trying to do stuff is, how can you define, okay, hey, you're going to work on this package. Don't drift off into the other ones. And again, this is also kind of difficult to describe in the current kind of constructs of prompting I've found. So a big thing I always do is combining tools. So some of my favorite combos would be taking TRAE and like an agent MCP. So most CLI tools have an MCP for them. And I want TRAE's context engine to drive this thing, but I might want a workhorse to go off and do all of the work. So TRAE is really good at understanding the context, and I can farm out work to a different model, and TRAE can essentially manage the model. So if the model comes back and says, hey, you know, these are the next steps, the TRAE agent can just say, okay, yeah, do the next steps, or review it, make some suggestions, and it's essentially those two talking to each other. And I'm not really dealing with the kind of dynamics between the models themselves, but there's some kind of management layer. The other one is kind of CLI with MCP agents as well, can give you a lot of concurrency, but it is tricky to tame this. So you do kind of want to watch what they're doing and how many nested levels you allow them to create. And you know, a big thing is task control, and the kind of maturity of this area is not great yet. Another kind of really big thing that I do in a lot of my, especially in front-end stuff, is, so this is actually something our infra team created, which is called MidScene, which is computer vision. So at ByteDance, we've trained a bunch of models on vision, and they're really, really good, but this also works with like other models from providers. But a big thing that I like to do is to give these things machine vision, because I find that's kind of one of the last areas missing from a model, is it should be able to see what it's doing and look at it, similar to how I'm looking at it. And so MidScene is also kind of useful because through the model, like when I put it in TRAE, TRAE can then control my Mac OS, not just my browser, like browser use, but I've seen, you know, whole OS operating systems controlled. I've seen Android phones controlled, browsers obviously, and the craziest one I've seen is robotic arms inside of like certain manufacturers, where they'll actually have arms interacting with the touch screens to test physical hardware. So really, really neat that you can squeeze all of this out of like SDKs or MCPs with these tools. So a big thing in like my endeavors into this is, I would say most of this also came because, I don't know if you remember when Anthropic said they were lowering the max plan limits. That kind of happened. That was some news recently. I don't know if anybody kind of saw that news. Well, so I know a few people inside of Anthropic, and my bad for that. It was me and I think 3 other people who were the top users doing tens of thousands a month on it. But what I discovered along the way is token conservation is a really big problem, especially after doing like, I think, $80,000 a month in subsidized usage. My bad. So it is a problem. I would say, though, definitely rely on subsidized tokens where you can, because you're getting a great deal. And some ways to kind of try and conserve tokens or make it better, especially when you're doing things like subagents. I see often, a lot of the times, they're all reading the same things. Or if it's like fix the lint errors, what do all the subtasks do? They run the lint command. So everybody's reading this massive thing, or just clogging up your process because they're all trying to run tests in parallel, not aware of the other one. So generally trying to find a good way to, like, and this isn't something a lot of tools have yet, but like middle management almost, where somebody runs it, figures out what's needed, and then breaks it up and says, okay, you're gonna work on these things, these, and just work on that small area, and not everybody charge off at once and do the same discovery work. So context sharing and things like that, I think, is something that'll mature more. But ways that I've kind of done it, memory files or context files, those do help a decent amount. A good also tool is repo mix. It'll just kind of create an XML bundle of your entire code base. So often I'll like drag and drop that into ChatGPT if I want GPT Pro to like review something in the code base, and I can just say, hey, here's an XML with the entire code base in there. Or just dropping that into a prompt. It doesn't have to go off and search through all the code and spend 10 minutes. If I know the model's got a large enough context window, I can just say, here's literally everything or a section of everything. Now look at it all and make your plan, and it charges off faster in the right direction. So, kind of what's missing, I would say, in general, from what I've seen, or what I'd like to see in the future from some tools, is context container is this idea that I had. So I actually got the terms from the TRAE team, because they've been talking about this idea of like container. But the idea that I kind of had for it was, if I work in a project every day, I'm in the IDE, every time I start a new chat, I kind of start from near zero. Now, some are a little bit better about understanding what I've been doing, but in general, what it would almost be nice to see is there's somebody watching, kind of. What do I do? So what did I do this week as a whole? And kind of just understanding that in the background, so they understand more of what is the intent of the user, how do they run things without me having to like write this all out in prompts. Something to just see like the habits of how things work, how they kind of work together, and longer term persistent memory would be really nice to kind of see. Inter-agent communication as well, I think that would be a really big one. I've experimented with like paging other models inside of sub-agents. A big challenge I think with this is, if you build something where two models chat to each other, they will get stuck in an infinite loop of waste. So like the nearest scenario that I found that's quite useful is almost like notifications. Hey, you have a new notification, check your notifications. And there can be a message from a different model, but they can't spin each other off into a loop. They can only read their notifications or broadcast one that another one may or may not decide to act on now or sometime in the future. But I would love to see better inter-agent communication. I think conflict management, especially for concurrency, is going to be a really big one as well. And some solution to work tree management kind of baked in would probably solve a lot of these type of challenges. So hoping to see that at some point. And yeah, so that's just kind of things that I've discovered along the way, tactics I use, workflows that I have. To kind of show you, let me jump out of the, just so you can kind of see, like, this is what I've been doing today, and this is more or less what every day looks like. But, so these are the active projects I'm working on at the moment. So something in Rust. This is an MCP system I've built for our CLI tools, where when you use RSPack and you go build, if it throws an error, the AI will automatically start fixing it. Adds like chat widgets in the front end through the build plugins, MCPs for every tool we've ever built. So, kind of working on that, improving that passively in the background. Over here, busy trying to solve some CI tests with, again, a tandem of using these and these together. Let's see what else is kind of going on. Over here, also working on an examples repo where I've been porting everything from like Cypress to Playwright, so on and so forth. But, the idea is I'm doing this a lot. And this essentially, some people say this is sad, some people don't, but I can't really say either way. I love doing this because, yes, I could write this, but I also could do 10 other things in parallel if I don't have to. I just need to make sure that when it's done, it's how I would have done it. And again, that comes into later. So a lot of this is how quickly can I navigate and digest and manage all these windows and potentially all these nested terminals if I'm really getting into a lot of concurrency. So the last thing kind of just wanted to get into, so using actually TRAE to build out an early concept where I discovered a lot of these ideas, TRAE's really great at the front end. And so what I had been using it for is kind of to build out this concept of, okay, how could I manage these agent tools better? This is the UI that it had helped me come up with. Building out work trees, being able to switch to them, new tasks, recent sessions of chats that I've been having on these things, being able to edit the agents. If I pop into the browser here, there's also, access to my GitHub space, fix with AI, research every Git issue that comes in, or any pull requests that we have. Here's all the PRs, what's the status on them? Oh, if that one's failing, I want to press a button, see it create a work tree, and go off in the background and fix it without me having to think about it. Just message me when you have a solution to it. And I would love a lot of that, where it's more pushing notifications to me instead of me having to pull and send things out to the agents to get them to work. Anyway, another thing you should definitely check out as well is the TRAE CLI. So it's still kind of getting built out, but it's performed pretty well. And again, I really do like these kind of scenarios because I've also had cases where it's a while loop until there's a breakout point. So you can take that, put in, choose your model, send it into a while loop, and it will break the while loop once it solves whatever it wants to solve, and I can go to sleep and wake up in the morning, and hopefully it's not still iterating. But yeah, so it's a combo of various CLI tools, whatever you like to kind of mix together. And of course, using TRAE, mostly because the UI is just super awesome for vibe coding, and the context engine is really, really nice. So I love using them together. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much for the amazing sharing from Zack. It's very nice. Anyone has a question? Okay, let's do it.
How do you tell this agent, like a TRAE, can you define the coding styles, such as don't put the CSS in your HTML or separate the controller logic from the service layer service layer logic? I don't want to tell them, if I don't want to tell them every time I ask question, are there a way that define one for all?
Yeah, so okay, so there's two scenarios. I don't know if you guys know somebody called Theo. He's a big YouTuber, streamer. Theo, yeah, wait, no, not Theo Vaughn, T3. He usually goes by T3. So I was talking to him about these type of scenarios. I've actually lost track of my thought. Can you ask the question again so I can remember it? Sorry.
How do I define the coding preferences?
Okay. So there's two scenarios I was chatting with him about on this. So the one is like, it'd be really nice if somebody was watching, and this doesn't exist, but in my head, I think this would be what would be really great. So ideal state, and then how I deal with it today. Ideal state, imagine you have somebody who passively watches. So when you send these corrections in, there's a model who watches what you do all day, every day, kind of summarizes it, almost like the GPT Pulse that just came out, where at night it thinks about everything you spoke about during the day and kind of writes new things to show you. That would be great, because I don't want to have to prompt it, like you said, not every time. And I also really hate having to create prompt files and do it every time, especially if you use a lot of tools. It's a nightmare. But it'd be nice if, like, hey, as I say these things, what am I having to correct it on a lot? Remember that, automatically kind of guide these agents. Now, how I deal with it today usually is, a lot of the time it's really deep research. Like, deep research works so well, at least in all the cases that I've tried it in. And again, I'm working on like bundlers, compilers, module loading systems. So they're generally fairly in-depth, which is a nice test for this type of stuff. But I often find, like, okay, deep research, how are things working now? And if you have existing code base, which is what I mostly work in, it works quite well. Are the standards already set up? Awesome. Now you can add like an agents MD file or something and give it some guidance, but generally it'll be, hey, research, how do the patterns work? Where do things already go? Who imports what? How does the code base currently work? You should be minimally invasive when adding new features. You should try to follow all the existing patterns and guides for things. Like, don't put a type file, just don't define a type at the top of a file if there's a types file somewhere else. But a lot of this relies on, did the model see that that was there? In a big way is, how does this thing work? What's the, you could almost say, like, ask 10 questions to prime it. So you go, hey, here's the 10 questions you need to answer before doing work. Now it understands through code, and I always think code is probably the best prompt you can give it. So go and look at how things work and follow those guidances and keep following. And usually don't have to nag it because it already sees, and its job is to match and align with the existing styles within the code base. And that has worked quite well for me so far. Not saying it's bulletproof.
Okay. Anyone, another question? Let's do it one by one.
Thanks, Zack. That was a great talk. I'm interested in the concept introduced as the warm-up. Can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Say that again?
Warm-up, the agent.
Yeah. So, like, it's usually, when I start a new chat with something, it starts from 0. So the biggest case I'll see is I say, hey, run the tests. So if I do that, it's probably gonna, half the time, depending on, like, TRAE's generally better about this, but I'm trying to speak more broadly about all the tools that I've encountered, as I imagine everybody uses a mix of tools. But a common pitfall I see is, oh, it'll try to use NPM, or something silly like that. So by warming it up, the idea is, like, familiarize yourself with what we use, what's our linter, where the commands run, what are the commands, so it doesn't run like 6 commands before realizing it's an NX repo and then running the NX commands. Like, go and understand how the code base works. Read through, like, what is it that we're working on? So if I have a plan to add this feature, what in my head do I know are the areas that we're going to be touching? Okay, hey, here's like the files, like the entry points. Go look at this, this, and this, maybe this folder. Now research how these aspects work together. What is it doing? Where does it go? Who depends on it? Where are the tests for it? What types does it use? What are the APIs available? Just trying to let it look around so when you give it a feature, it doesn't just go off the sentence that you gave it and try and figure out this code base based on one sentence. But you're kind of like, explore, look around, tell me how it works. Ask it questions you already know, but that are going to make it dig around before you give it a task. This kind of also helps and it depends on the model, but some models I found are too eager to start working. Like I see this with Grok. Grok, I love how fast it is, but I'm like, whoa, buddy, okay, like, let's look around first. Let's not just start. But what I've also found is like mixing the models. So often I'll use GPT-5 with Grok as a sub-agent so that my writes are really cheap and fast, but I have a good brain driving and reviewing the work. But again, it comes into, okay, how can you warm this up? How can you make sure that the model has a better bearing so that it's not just blindly hunting around for, like grep for test and look at a million unrelated things, kind of point it in there and then have it go and explore on its own so that you're not writing a massive prompt file and the model's not just aimlessly searching either too broad or too narrow.
One more question, just based on what you said. What exactly is the sub-agent? What exactly is the sub-agent that you just said that you use GPT-5, then use Grok as sub-agent?
So the sub-agent, so most of these tools, and this is because I've like taken apart many of them, but like a lot of the tools, like even inside of TRAE, in most CLI tools, when you're doing the work, it's not the chat that you're talking with that's carrying the work out. The chat probably is talking to like an edit agent who's actually performing the code edits. Now, some tools allow you to modify or change which model, which piece uses, or to define new sub-agents. So often I'll do that where I'll kind of mix and match it. So I'll say, hey, use the code editor sub-agent, which has access to all the same tools as the parent one, but the parent one might be a bigger, slower thinking model that can tell a dumb but fast model to go and do something, and then it can check it. So it's kind of trying to also think for mixing costs. The biggest cost in AI is egress, is output tokens. So what I often try to think about in like custom workflows is, okay, how do I combine good thinking with fast, cheap output? Because if the model's good enough to review what's going on, I can use a really dumb model to just write it down, because writing is the least valuable part of the workflow, and it's also the most expensive. So finding a model that's just good at editing files, but not good at thinking, or just do this and do that, and now you have somebody correcting that one, and it drops the cost and also makes it faster. But it depends on the tools that you have or are using.
Yeah, so you talked about like splitting agents between tasks, and kind of you showed us there that you had like 8 different. I don't know if they're different projects or if they're all linked together.
So usually, so I have like 2 that are the same project, and I just duplicated the repo, poor man's work trees. But then the rest of them are separate repos.
Okay, so say you were working on like a web app or something. How would you open like multiple instances of say TRAE to then work on different parts of the web app at the same time?
It depends on like how deviated the task is. And I think this is also a challenge that we need to solve in the interface aspect in general, even in CLIs, like everywhere. I think a big challenge is also AI labs are usually producing the tools, and AI labs aren't building with the tools every day. So this does create like some time for them to figure out how we're using it, I guess. But I think there's a couple concepts here. The one way that I found, and maybe this is because I'm ADHD, but often I'll be working on something and then I'm going to branch into, oh wait, but I can go and do this. And that's often how a lot of dev workflows that I see is halfway through, you realize you could do something better. Now, do you derail what you're currently doing? Or do you hope that you remember it for later? But so there's, I think, when you're working on a certain task, is this something that's going to bubble up onto the same branch? Like it's technically part of the same deliverable, but you could tackle 3 parts in parallel to it? That's kind of akin to, forking or branching off of the conversation. And in doing that, I think a lot of this comes down to, well, what is the task? So I'm trying to think of some examples that I've had. Usually it's things where I know they're not necessarily going to conflict, so I don't have to get into conflict management. But if, I'm working on fixing this and it's like, oh, well, like when I was building the UI out, it's like, okay, here's my chat interface. Now I'm working on adding this work tree management stuff, but I want my tool calls to render when they're streamed back in the chat. So I'm not going to create 2 different PRs for that. I just want to quickly go and fix it. Can spin something up, and I know that these are, this is in that folder, this is in this one. The chances of them touching each other are slim, and if there is some overlap, usually the models can see that, oh, it was recently edited after I did it, and it kind of knows not to mess with it or override it again. But yeah, I would say managing this is really, it depends on what you're trying to do, and some of it is just thinking, okay, up front, where are the areas I know I could split it off more or less? Or as you get into it, what are other areas that you can go and scope it into? So I find monorepos is a good example of where this is useful, because you also have separate builds that you could run, type checking that you could run that's not necessarily going to mess with like the single app.
Okay. One last question. Okay. Maybe we can do it first.
Yeah, just following on Jack's question. So does Solo have the ability to really see the front end and seeing what's actually on the web, or is it not? Because that's one of the big problems with Claude is you can't you got to tell it and you got to input it, and it'll look at it if you upload the file, but inside of the instance, is it to do that or not?
Do you want machine vision?
I wanted to see what the
your eyes see.
Exactly.
Okay. I think in the current version of Solo, it's not there yet, but I have spoken to all of the team and saying like, hey, look, you got everything already there. Just take a screenshot and attach it as well. So not currently, but I would say TRAE is definitely the one where this would not be as difficult as other tools, because the integrated browser, it already gets, it gets your HTML, it has everything except the screenshot. So it understands terminal, the console errors, it can see the markup, it has a selector so I can send it the XPath to the node I'm talking about, but I'm hoping by the next release I can convince them to add vision support. What I'd really love to see in there is computer use. Now, if you wanted to sideload this on, mid-scene would be really useful, because we offer, it's also from ByteDance, but it offers, you can do either MCP, and it will add computer use, browser use, so it uses machine vision only to interact and navigate everything. So that's often what I'll do inside of TRAE as well, is say, hey, here's a MCP, use that to click, navigate, and actually use the app, but it's all vision-based. It's not DOM or, playwright style.
And then just a second question, is it smart enough to make sure the CSS is organized so that the main frame's got all of the positioning and the subframes are flex, or not yet?
This really depends on the model interpreting visuals.
Okay.
So this is not even like a TRAE thing or a tool thing. And I found a lot of models in the US are not as good at machine vision, and I'm not 100% sure why, but it really does depend on who the model is. Some of them are trained better to understand layout, which I think is a big thing. I would say for a US model, probably the good ones are, so there's Quinn, the Quinn VLM, well, that's not a US model, but so Quinn, the VLM model, open source model, but it's one of the best that we've used. I would say if I ranked it, it would be ByteDance's I can't pronounce it, Dubao? Our seed model. Our seed VLM model is the best that we've seen in benchmarks. Then I would say it's Quinn's VLM. And then below that, I would say Gemini 2.5 Pro. So if you're looking for a model to use for machine vision or for something like mid-scene, one of those 3 models is going to give you really good results, really reliable clicking, interacting with navs. So.
Thank you so much. Due to the time limitation, if you get another question, directly reach out to Zack, after keynote. So let's welcome to next TRAE power user. Okay, Jin Yuan.